The winter of 1944 descended upon Europe like a shroud of death. In the Ardennes forest, where the skeletal remains of ancient trees reached toward a pale December sky, Hitler had unleashed his final, desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Führer's vision was clear: split the Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was the delusion of a man who could no longer distinguish between strategic brilliance and suicidal fantasy. But for the American soldiers caught in the path of this onslaught, Hitler's delusions translated into very real horror. The attack came on December 16th, a date that would be seared into the memory of every man who survived it. 3 German armies, comprising over 200,000 troops and hundreds of tanks, crashed through the thinly held American lines with the force of an avalanche. The speed and ferocity of the assault caught the Allies completely off guard. Supreme Commander Eisenhower's headquarters had dismissed intelligence warnings, convinced that the Germans were too depleted, too broken to mount such an offensive. This miscalculation would cost thousands of lives. At the center of this maelstrom stood the town of Bastogne, an insignificant Belgian crossroads that would become the hinge upon which the entire battle turned. Bastogne's value lay not in its size or strategic importance, but in its geography. 7 major roads converged at this point, making it essential for any German advance westward. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of the battle. The Wehrmacht understood this. So did the Americans. The 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, found themselves thrust into this crucible almost by accident. They had been resting in Mormelin, France, recovering from the brutal fighting in Operation Market Garden. These were elite paratroopers, trained for vertical envelopment and rapid assault, not prolonged defensive sieges. Yet when the German offensive exploded across the Ardennes, the 101st was the only unit immediately available to plug the gap. On December 18th, they received orders to move to Bastogne immediately. They had no winter equipment, insufficient ammunition, and no clear intelligence about what they were facing. Many didn't even have proper winter clothing. Commanding this hastily assembled defense was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a square-jawed artilleryman who possessed the rare combination of tactical brilliance and unshakable composure under fire. McAuliffe arrived in Bastogne on December 19th to find chaos. Retreating American units streamed through the town, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear, bringing tales of German panzers and SS troops materializing from the fog like demons. Civilian refugees clogged the roads, desperate to escape the advancing enemy. McAuliffe had approximately 18,000 men, the 101st Airborne plus attached units, to defend a perimeter that would soon be completely surrounded. The German noose tightened with methodical precision. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely encircled. The sound of German artillery became a constant backdrop, punctuated by the crack of small arms fire and the rumble of approaching tanks. The weather turned brutally cold, with temperatures plunging below freezing. Thick fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating any possibility of air support or resupply. The defenders were alone, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them significantly with dwindling ammunition and medical supplies. It was in this context, surrounded, outgunned, freezing, and running out of supplies, that the Germans made their calculated psychological play. On December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum typed on 2 sheets of paper demanding the honorable surrender of the American forces in Bastogne. The message warned of the annihilation that would follow if the Americans refused, invoking the suffering of the civilian population and the futility of continued resistance. McAuliffe's response has become one of the most famous moments in American military history. When his staff officers brought him the German ultimatum, he read it, crumpled it up, and uttered a single word: nuts. His operations officer suggested this might not be formal enough for an official reply, but McAuliffe insisted. The typed response that went back to the Germans read simply, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The German officers were reportedly baffled by the slang, requiring an explanation that it meant, "Go to hell." But McAuliffe's defiant reply, while legendary, was only a gesture, a symbolic act of resistance that did nothing to change the brutal arithmetic of the siege. The 101st Airborne was still surrounded, still running out of ammunition, still freezing in inadequate foxholes. The Germans intensified their attacks, probing for weaknesses, grinding down the defenders through attrition. Every hour that passed brought Bastogne closer to collapse. The wounded accumulated in makeshift aid stations, their moans filling the cold air. Medics operated by candlelight, performing amputations without adequate anesthesia.
Bodies froze in the positions where they fell.
300 miles to the west, in the sterile conference rooms of Chef headquarters in Versailles, the Supreme Allied Command grappled with a crisis that threatened to unravel everything they had achieved since D-Day. General Dwight Eisenhower, the affable Kansas farm boy who had risen to command the largest military coalition in history, faced the greatest test of his leadership. The German offensive had carved a massive bulge into Allied lines, hence the battle's name, creating a salient 50 miles deep and 70 miles wide. American units were scattered, communications were severed, and panic rippled through the ranks. The specter of defeat, which had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, now loomed with terrifying clarity. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of his senior commanders on December 19th at Verdun, a location heavy with historical irony, the site of France's bloodiest battle in World War I, where over 700,000 men had perished in a meat grinder of attrition. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense, suffocating. Intelligence officers presented maps showing the extent of the German penetration, each red arrow representing a Wehrmacht division driving deeper into Allied territory. Some commanders advocated for retreat, for consolidating lines and preparing defensive positions. The specter of 1940 hung over the discussion, the memory of how quickly France had collapsed under German assault. But Eisenhower recognized something his subordinates had missed. This wasn't a German victory, it was an opportunity. By launching this offensive, Hitler had pulled his mobile reserves out of their defensive positions and exposed them to counterattack. The Führer had gambled everything on speed and shock, but the fierce resistance at places like Bastogne was slowing the German advance, bleeding it of momentum. Eisenhower's strategic vision crystallized: hold the shoulders of the Bulge, deny the Germans their objectives, and then crush the exposed salient with counterattacks from north and south. It was bold, aggressive, and required perfect coordination between two men who despised each other, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Patton entered the conference room like a force of nature, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, his face set in that familiar expression of barely contained aggression. While other generals spoke of defense and consolidation, Patton saw only offense. He had been studying the maps, running calculations, preparing for this moment. When Eisenhower asked how quickly Patton could disengage his Third Army from its current operations in the Saar and wheel 90 degrees north to strike the southern flank of the German Bulge, Patton's response stunned the room: 48 hours. Most of the assembled officers laughed, assuming it was typical Patton bravado. Wheeling an entire army through winter conditions across improvised supply lines and launching a coordinated attack in 2 days was considered impossible by every conventional military standard. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He had already anticipated the scenario, had already issued preliminary orders to his staff. This was vintage Patton, the student of military history who had studied Hannibal's campaigns and Napoleon's maneuvers, the general who believed that speed and audacity could shatter any defense. More than that, Patton understood something fundamental about warfare that eluded more cautious commanders. Momentum was everything. The Germans had seized the initiative through surprise and violence. The only way to wrest it back was through equally violent counterattack, delivered with such speed that the enemy had no time to adjust. Yet there was one man in that room who remained skeptical, one voice of caution that carried immense weight: General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and Patton's immediate superior. Bradley was Patton's opposite in almost every respect: methodical where Patton was impulsive, diplomatic where Patton was confrontational, cautious where Patton was reckless. They had been classmates at West Point decades earlier, but their paths had diverged dramatically. Bradley represented the new American military establishment: professional, educated, media-friendly, politically astute. Patton represented the old warrior ethos: visceral, intuitive, politically radioactive, but undeniably brilliant in combat. Bradley's relationship with Patton was complicated, layered with rivalry, resentment, and grudging respect. Bradley had risen through the ranks through competence and political acumen, while Patton had clawed his way back from disgrace after the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, where he had physically struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, nearly ending his career. Eisenhower had saved Patton, recognizing that despite his flaws, the man was an irreplaceable tactical genius. But the incident had inverted the natural hierarchy. Bradley, once Patton's subordinate, now command-a-come. For a man of Patton's ego, this was a bitter pill. The strategic disagreement between Bradley and Patton in the days following the German offensive revealed this underlying tension. Bradley initially resisted splitting his command, reluctant to send Patton's Third Army on what seemed like a desperate gamble. The conventional military wisdom suggested consolidating forces, establishing defensive lines, and wearing down the German attack through attrition. This was Bradley's comfort zone: methodical, systematic, low risk. But Bastogne changed the calculus. The 101st Airborne's stubborn defense had created a fulcrum, a fixed point around which the entire battle could pivot. If Bastogne fell, the German offensive would accelerate, potentially reaching the Meuse River and beyond. If Bastogne held and could be relieved, the German offensive would stall, leaving their forces exposed and vulnerable. Patton saw this immediately.
He understood that wars were won not by cautious defense, but by seizing fleeting opportunities for decisive action. The weather would eventually clear, allowing Allied air power to devastate the exposed German columns, but only if American forces could hold key positions and launch coordinated counterattacks. Bastogne was that key position, and the 101st Airborne's defiant stand, symbolized by McAuliffe's one-word response to the German surrender demand, had bought time. But time was running out. Every hour of delay increased the likelihood that the encircled defenders would be overrun, that their ammunition would run dry, that the cold and constant bombardment would break their spirit.
On December 22nd, as McAuliffe's nuts reply was making its way back to the baffled German commanders, Patton's Third Army was already in motion. What followed was one of the most impressive logistical and tactical maneuvers in military history, a testament to Patton's obsessive planning and his staff's exceptional execution. Over 133,000 vehicles, carrying more than 250,000 troops, began a 90-degree pivot northward through some of the worst winter conditions Europe had seen in decades. Roads were sheets of ice, snow fell in blinding curtains, visibility dropped to near zero. Yet Patton's columns moved with clockwork precision, guided by officers who had been secretly briefed days earlier, operating under contingency plans that Patton had developed while other commanders were still processing the shock of the German offensive. This was Patton at his finest, not the caricature of the bloodthirsty warrior that popular imagination had created, but the consummate professional who understood that modern warfare was won through superior logistics, communications, and staff work as much as through courage on the battlefield. His headquarters became a nerve center of controlled chaos, with officers working in shifts around the clock, coordinating fuel deliveries, ammunition resupply, route assignments, and tactical objectives. Patton himself seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, visiting forward units, haranguing supply officers, studying maps, issuing orders with that peculiar mix of profanity and brilliance that characterized his leadership style. But even Patton's legendary aggression couldn't alter the fundamental reality. Bastogne was running out of time. Intelligence reports from the besieged garrison painted an increasingly desperate picture. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Artillery batteries were rationing shells, firing only at confirmed targets rather than conducting suppressive bombardments. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, with morphine reserved only for the most severe cases. Food was scarce, reduced to cold sea rations eaten in frozen foxholes. The wounded lay in cellars and bombed-out buildings, their suffering amplified by the bitter cold and the constant concussion of German artillery. Most critically, the weather remained overcast, preventing any aerial resupply drops. The German forces surrounding Bastogne intensified their pressure, sensing that the American defense was reaching its breaking point. The Wehrmacht threw elite units into the assault, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. These were not the green recruits or hastily assembled fortress battalions that the Allies had been facing in recent months, but veteran combat formations, commanded by experienced officers who understood how to exploit weaknesses. They probed the American perimeter constantly, looking for gaps, launching coordinated attacks supported by armor and artillery. Each assault cost the defenders casualties they couldn't afford, whittling down the force that stood between German victory and strategic failure. On December 23rd, a miracle occurred. Not a divine intervention, but a meteorological shift that proved equally decisive. The weather cleared. For the first time in days, the fog lifted, the clouds parted, and cold winter sunlight illuminated the battlefield. Within hours, the sky filled with Allied aircraft. C-47 transport planes roared over Bastogne at low altitude, their bellies packed with ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Parachutes blossomed across the sky like flowers, drifting down toward the desperate defenders below. Fighter bombers and medium bombers ranged across the German positions, strafing columns, bombing assembly areas, destroying the supply lines that fed the offensive. The psychological impact was immense. The besieged garrison knew they weren't forgotten, knew that relief was coming. But aerial resupply, while crucial, wasn't enough. The 101st Airborne needed physical relief, a breakthrough that would reopen ground communications and allow for the evacuation of wounded, the resupply of heavy equipment, and the reinforcement of the garrison. This was Patton's assignment, and he attacked it with characteristic fury. His lead elements, the 4th Armored Division, under the aggressive leadership of General C.U. Gaffey, drove northward along multiple axes, smashing through German defensive positions with a combination of speed, firepower, and tactical innovation. Patton had personally selected the officers leading this assault, men who shared his philosophy of relentless offense, who understood that in mobile warfare, hesitation was death. The advance toward Bastogne became a brutal chess match played at highway speeds.
German forces attempted to establish blocking positions, but Patton's armor simply bypassed them, leaving infantry to mop up while the tanks pushed forward. When they encountered prepared defenses that couldn't be bypassed, they called in artillery and airstrikes, pulverizing the positions before advancing. It was combined arms warfare at its most effective. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working in seamless coordination. But it was also horrifically costly. German anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams exacted a heavy toll on American armor. Villages became killing grounds where every building concealed enemy soldiers. The winter landscape turned red with blood, littered with the smoking hulks of destroyed tanks and the frozen corpses of men from both sides. Bradley watched Patton's advance from headquarters, his emotions a complex mixture of admiration, anxiety, and something approaching envy. Here was his subordinate, the man he nominally commanded, executing a maneuver that would be studied in military academies for generations. Bradley understood the stakes. If Patton succeeded in relieving Bastogne, he would cement his reputation as America's greatest tactical commander. If he failed, the 101st Airborne would likely be destroyed. The German offensive might succeed, and Bradley himself would bear partial responsibility for approving such a risky operation. The tension in the command post was palpable as staff officers marked Patton's advance on maps, updating positions hourly, calculating distances, estimating arrival times. On December 26th, the breakthrough came. Elements of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a tank commander whose aggressive tactics mirrored Patton's own philosophy, punched through the final German defensive line south of Bastogne. At approximately 4:45 p.m., the lead tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with forward elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. After 7 days of encirclement, brutal combat, and unimaginable hardship, the defenders of Bastogne were no longer alone. The relief column brought fresh troops, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, the psychological assurance that the American military machine would not abandon its soldiers, no matter how desperate the situation. The meeting between the relieving forces and the besieged garrison was relatively subdued. Exhausted men don't celebrate with enthusiasm. They simply acknowledge survival and prepare for the next phase. But at higher command levels, the relief of Bastogne represented a turning point. The German offensive, which had begun with such promise and momentum, was now definitively stalled. Hitler's gamble had failed. The Wehrmacht had expended irreplaceable reserves, tanks, fuel, ammunition, and veteran troops in an offensive that achieved tactical surprise but not strategic success. The Allies would now transition from defense to offense, squeezing the Bulge from multiple directions, turning Hitler's attack into a trap that would consume the very forces he had committed to it.
The relief of Bastogne sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure, but the reverberations were felt most profoundly in the relationship between Bradley and Patton, two men whose partnership embodied the tension between caution and audacity that defined American military doctrine. In the immediate aftermath of the breakthrough, as casualty reports were tallied and after-action assessments compiled, Bradley faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Patton had been right. The impossible maneuver, the reckless gamble that conventional wisdom had dismissed as fantasy, had succeeded. More than succeeded, it had potentially saved the entire Allied campaign in Western Europe. The question of what Bradley actually said to Patton in those crucial days after the relief has become a subject of historical debate, obscured by conflicting accounts, institutional politics, and the natural human tendency to revise history through the lens of subsequent events. The official records are characteristically bland, sterile military communications devoid of emotion or personal sentiment. But those who were present in the headquarters, who witnessed the interactions between these two complex men, reported something more nuanced than the sanitized official version suggests. According to multiple accounts from staff officers and aides, Bradley's initial response was one of visible relief mixed with professional acknowledgement. He had authorized Patton's counterattack, yes, but he had done so with profound reservations, acutely aware that failure would destroy not just Patton's career but his own. The burden of command at this level was immense. Every decision potentially cost thousands of lives. Every miscalculation could alter the course of history. Bradley was not a man given to effusive praise or emotional displays, but those who knew him recognized the subtle signs of deep respect in his demeanor during the post-relief meetings. What Bradley understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the Allied command structure, was that Patton had achieved something that transcended mere tactical success. He had demonstrated that the American military, when properly led and motivated, could match or exceed the vaunted German prowess in mobile warfare. For years, Wehrmacht commanders had dominated through superior tactical doctrine, better combined arms coordination, and more aggressive leadership. Patton had beaten them at their own game, using their own principles of speed and audacity against them. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological triumph that fundamentally altered the balance of confidence between Allied and German forces. In the conversations that followed, some formal, others informal, and witnessed only by a small circle of senior officers, Bradley reportedly expressed admiration for Patton's operational planning and execution. But he tempered this praise with characteristic caution, noting the risks involved and the heavy casualties suffered by the 4th Armored Division during the relief operation. This was Bradley's nature, to acknowledge success while simultaneously calculating its cost, to recognize brilliance while remaining cognizant of the broader strategic picture. He was the steady hand that balanced Patton's aggressive instincts, the institutional voice that prevented recklessness from becoming disaster. Yet beneath this professional courtesy lay deeper currents of complicated emotion. Bradley could not entirely escape the awareness that Patton's triumph highlighted his own limitations. Bradley was a superior administrator, a better politician, more acceptable to the media and to civilian leadership. But Patton was the superior combat commander, the man soldiers would follow into hell because they believed he could lead them out the other side. This fundamental difference created an unspoken tension that would persist for the remainder of the war. Bradley commanded Patton, but he could never truly control him, and both men knew it. The strategic implications of Bastogne's relief extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Hitler's gamble had not merely failed, it had catastrophically backfired. The Führer had committed his last mobile reserves, his final stocks of fuel and ammunition, to an offensive that was now collapsing. The German forces trapped in the Ardennes salient would be systematically destroyed over the following weeks, ground down by Allied attacks from multiple directions. Experienced officers and irreplaceable equipment were being consumed in a futile attempt to salvage an already lost battle. This was Hitler's pattern, the refusal to acknowledge failure, the insistence on holding untenable positions, the sacrifice of armies to preserve personal prestige. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, with fierce fighting throughout January 1945 as Allied forces compressed the salient and pushed the Germans back to their original start lines. The weather remained brutal, the terrain difficult, the German resistance stubborn, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Patton's Third Army, now operating in concert with Montgomery's forces attacking from the north, systematically dismantled the German position. Each village recaptured, each road junction secured, represented another nail in the coffin of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. For the men who had defended Bastogne, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne and attached units, the relief brought survival but not respite. They remained in combat, fighting to expand the corridor that Patton had opened, clearing German forces from the surrounding area, dealing with the grim aftermath of siege warfare. The toll was written on their faces: exhaustion, trauma, the thousand-yard stare of men who had looked into the abyss and somehow survived. McAuliffe's defiant nuts had become legendary, but the reality behind that legend was blood, frozen corpses, amputations performed in makeshift aid stations, and the screams of wounded men that echoed through cold December nights. Bradley's assessment of Patton's achievement, delivered in the clinical language of after-action reports and strategic analyses, recognized the operation's success while noting its costs and risks. Approximately 19,000 American casualties had been suffered during the relief operation, killed, wounded, or missing. The 4th Armored Division had lost nearly half its tank strength. Infantry battalions that had started the offensive at full strength were reduced to skeleton crews. These numbers haunted Bradley, who bore the weight of command responsibility for every American life expended in Europe. Patton, by contrast, viewed casualties differently, not callously, but through the lens of a warrior who believed that aggressive action, despite its immediate costs, ultimately saved lives by shortening wars and preventing prolonged attrition. The dichotomy between these two perspectives, Bradley's careful calculation versus Patton's aggressive instinct, would define American military leadership for generations. Both approaches had merit, both had limitations. Bradley's caution prevented disasters born of recklessness. Patton's audacity achieved victories that cautious commanders would never attempt. The ideal, perhaps, was the synthesis that Eisenhower managed, using both men according to their strengths, balancing their opposing philosophies to achieve strategic objectives that neither could accomplish alone. In the final analysis, what Bradley said to Patton mattered less than what the relief of Bastogne represented. It was proof that American forces, properly trained and aggressively led, could execute complex operations under the most challenging conditions. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, despite its fearsome reputation, was vulnerable to the same tactics it had used to dominate Europe for 5 years. Most importantly, it showed that leadership, the willingness to take calculated risks, to trust in the abilities of subordinates, to act decisively when action was required, remained the decisive factor in warfare, more important than numbers or technology or logistics. The snow continued to fall across the Ardennes that winter, covering the battlefield in a white shroud that concealed the evidence of slaughter. Patton had kept his impossible promise, wheeling an entire army in 48 hours and smashing through to relieve Bastogne. Bradley had authorized the operation, despite his reservations, and taken responsibility for its outcome. Together, these two very different men had achieved something that would be remembered long after the personal tensions between them had faded into historical footnote.
They had demonstrated that American military power, when properly directed, was unstoppable, and that realization would echo across the remaining months of the war and into the post-war world that was already taking shape in the minds of strategic planners.